Well, first things first, we talk about the upcoming elections. Now, more than 1.4 million eligible voters have registered for this year's presidential and National Assembly elections. Whether all of them will show up at the polls remains to be seen. Joining us in studio is IPPR's Executive Director, Hopwood, to talk to us about the determinants of voters' choice. A very good evening, Mr. Graham. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Yeah, good evening, John.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you in studio. First of all, let's talk about, the determinants of voters' choice. How would you, judge the elections campaign season so far? And, how much will this influence voters' choice in your perspective? Yeah?
Well, I think so far we've seen a lot of the parties appealing to their base, if you like, their core supporters, making sure they are mobilized and rallied to vote. Yeah. And that's obviously through campaign events and rallies and those kind of things. I think what we're lacking is interactivity in the sense of parties trying to interact with undecided voters and to try and win them over, which could be a very important factor at this election because of the youth demographic, because 42% of the registered voters are under 35. There's a fair chance that quite a lot of them will be what can be considered floating voters, not yet fully decided where they might put their cross. And so I think the parties need to be more proactive in that sense. And the other thing that's lacking, I think, is interactivity between the parties. Mm-hmm. So we're not seeing enough debates between candidates, between the presidential candidates, debates about the manifestos and so on. I know there have been attempts to do that, but often key players and key candidates are missing. So that's a bit sad in a way, because that would enable those voters who haven't yet made up their mind to be able to compare and contrast what they're hearing from different parties and different candidates.
Mm-hmm. Earlier on, we just spoke about the youth, especially. We see, most political parties have a focus on the youth, which represents the majority of the voting populace, in essence, and with campaign promises to section into millions and billions of dollars. Will this likely, influence the voter choices? And would you say that that promises that are actually generally made by the political parties, do you think that they are generally steeped into reality, and the promises that are made are actual in essence?
I think a lot of voters will sense that these promises that are made in the manifestos and in some speeches are possibly unrealistic and sort of entering the realm of fantasy. It's nice to have fantastic wish lists about what you want to do if you were the governing party, but in fact, since independence, we've only had one governing party, and it's noticeable that their manifesto is a little bit more cautious in terms of figures. I mean, there are some figures there that I don't really understand about the job creation projections, but generally the language is quite cautious. And the other parties, the opposition, are the ones that are promising heaven and earth. Well, I think what they need to do to convince the voters more is to do the sums, do some costings and say how they're going to actually be able to introduce these kind of very expensive policies, whether it's land or housing or whatever. And how are they going to raise the finance? How are they going to change the budget fundamentally, and so on? We're not hearing those kind of explanations, or not in much detail. So I think a lot of voters will think, well, this is amazing, sounds good, but in reality, we don't see this happening.
Now, party identification, especially among senior voters, obviously, plays a role in terms of voters' loyalty. To what extent does familiarity and, a particular candidate's characteristic, plays with or influence a voter's choice?
Well, I think a lot of voters in the past have voted maybe on the basis of history, what parties did in the past, what even they were doing before 1990. Right. And also, unfortunately, I think sometimes on the basis of regionalism or tribal identity as well. As Namibia becomes a younger and more urbanized society, I think these factors gradually become less important, and people will look more to policies and issues that the parties are raising and their leading personalities, their presidential candidates and so on, to make choices, particularly, I think, younger voters. So I think it'll be interesting to see how to gauge this at this election, but I certainly think the nature of Namibian elections are changing, and this is likely to be the most competitive election we've had since independence.
Very well. You just mentioned policies there. So how do you think really the role of policy and policy preferences play a role in determining voters' voting decisions in the country?
Well, as a policy analyst, I'd love to think that a lot of voters were getting hold of the manifestos, engaging with them, comparing them, and then deciding who they want to vote for on the basis of those manifesto proposals. But in reality, I think we know that not many people do engage on that level with the manifestos. So they might hear a particular policy or a particular line in a politician's speech that they like, that they identify with, that makes them think, okay, I might vote for that party, or probably more important is the personalities. If they feel that they have some in common with the leader of the party, with the presidential candidate, if they feel that that person stands for them and their interests in some way, then that will be another key determining factor.
Now, if we go back into history, Graham, we've seen voter turnouts fluctuate, over the years. For instance, in 1989, it stood around 400,000, then around 800,000, and then, years between 2004 and 2019. In your observation, what could be, the factors that may be responsible for those turnouts in numbers?
So in 1989, it was said at the time that we had a 99% turnout, and that was the highest ever in a voluntary election. So it was almost bound to come down after that, of course. And we had a lot of enthusiasm for elections in the early 90s, mid-90s, relatively high turnouts. I think over time, younger voters have felt more disengaged and maybe apathetic in some respects. Also maybe disillusioned with what they thought would be the fruits of democracy, which haven't emerged. Poverty hasn't been alleviated to the extent that they wanted. And then also we have to remember, until fairly recently, we knew who was going to win the election. It was a sort of foregone conclusion. We had a very dominant party, upwards of 3/4 of the vote going to them in most elections since independence. So because of that, I think some voters would have just felt, well, what's the point? So the turnouts have gone down, but what's encouraging about this election is that we've had a very high voter registration figure. 90% of eligible voters turned out in June and July to register, indicating that we could get a bounce back in terms of turnout in this election. Although, we have to wait and see on what happens on November the 27th.
Absolutely. Well, your final remarks, perhaps, Mr. Graham, before we let you go.
Well, one thing I wanted to say was that one thing that will affect turnout is that voters have to feel confident in the electoral process. And the turmoil we've seen this week around the selection of the company for printing the ballots has certainly, I think, started to undermine confidence in the Electoral Commission. And they really need to handle that in a way that restores the faith of all the voters, so that we don't see people not voting because they feel that this election might be seriously flawed in some way. So let's hope that issue can be solved very quickly. But it won't be solved by legal letters and just stern warnings in press releases. There has to be an acknowledgement from the ECN of legitimate concerns of the voting public.
Absolutely. We can't wait to see those developments, and of course also hear more on what happens in that regard. Thank you so much, Mr. Graham, for making the time.
Thank you.
Absolutely.